Good afternoon. My name is Rolonda Teal. I have been employed at Oakland Plantation as a contract anthropologist off and on for the past 10 years. And so that is my interest in this particular site. Today, we're going to take a journey, if you will. And by journey, we're going to journey into the lives of the people who actually worked on the plantation. And so we're going to begin right here at Oakland. This image right here is, does anyone know what it is?
No, what is that?
What this is a pot that was used. It could be used one of two ways. One is for washing clothes, and another one might have been to cook, to make sugar in. You would have had to boil your sugar cane and all and cook your sugar, so you would have needed a lot for a plantation. But this is the kind of information that we're going to be finding out about as we continue on this virtual tour. Now, before we begin, there are two things that I have an expectation of. One is that you will experience some type of emotion along this tour, whether it's sadness, whether it's a feeling of excitement or whatever, and that later on when you're by yourself that you'll think about what that emotion was and what it was that you saw that stirred that emotion. The second thing I'd like to see happen is I'd like for you to be able to take away from this something new that you've learned about plantations, or at least maybe something that alters the way you once thought about plantations. Again, my name is Rolonda. Everybody calls me Ro. Feel free to stop at any point and ask questions, or if there's something else that you would like to know about, I'd like to know that now. Is there something that you specifically would like to learn about?
Just to get the feel of how the workers on the plantation experience things.
Okay, I'm glad that's one of the things you want to know about, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. All right, let's begin our journey. I just want you to get a little bit familiar with what we're talking about. This is the state of Louisiana. We're right here in Natchez Parish, and this is Natchez Parish blown up. We're specifically going to be talking about this area here known as Natchez, Louisiana. To give you some layout of the plantation so you can get a feel as we move along where we are, if you were to come here to the national park to visit, you would enter right here in the visitors parking area. And this is where you would park, and you'd come right out here by the pavilion, and from here you could go in any direction you wanted to on the plantation. But for this presentation, I've chosen, instead of talking about every single building, or 9 buildings, because I think that they are especially significant when we talk about the workers and their lives. And so these 9 buildings then are going to be the slave and tenant cabin, right here in this area. We're going to go from there to the overseer's house, from there to the corn crib, from there across the plantation to the plantation store, to the mule barn and carpenter shed, from there to the wash house and fattening pen, over to the cook's house, and then finally we'll stop here at the big house. Everybody kind of get a feel of how we're going to zigzag across the plantation? Okay.
Pretty much.
Pretty much. Very good then. So, one thing now I want you to keep in mind as we talk about a plantation is that you have to remember that a plantation in that day was a business. Whether we think it was a moral business or ethically run business, it was still a business. They were in the business of agriculture, exporting cotton, exporting corn and crops and things. And just like a business, you had divisions on the plantation. So you had 3 types of workers. You had your field workers, you had your specialized workers, and then you had your house workers. And just like a business, you had your management. What do you think the manager might have been on the plantation?
That overseer or
Overseer,
owner.
exactly. The overseer was the manager, and the owner then would have been the CEO of the company. So this plantation was established in 1789 by Pierre Emmanuel Prudhomme, basically off of French land grants. He acquired all of this land. And so, of course, one of the first things that you want to be able to do, just like if you're starting a business, you're going to find your place. Where am I going to lay my business out? And now let me get prepared to build on this site. And so part of the building then, to get ready to build, was the clearing of the land. This area was very densely populated, very dense with trees. So you had to cut out spaces in order to just start your buildings. Has anybody ever heard of the term a hand? What is a hand other than the physical hand that we know about?
I think of a handful.
A handful, like the image there. Of course, it literally is a handful of something as we see. But right here in this area, at least, in antebellum and postbellum times, the people who worked on the plantation were referred to as hands and not necessarily as slaves, as sharecroppers. So when you think about it like this, and here's an example of what it might look like, they would say 3 hands worked on the corn houses, or hands were sick with mumps today. And so when we look at it like that, what we're talking about then is not only the labor force being hands, but the actual literal hands that it took in order to keep a plantation or business running. So that by the time we reach the Civil War era, Faneuil Prudhomme's son has 146 hands, but if we multiply that by 2, then you see how many hands were actually working on a daily basis to keep this plantation running. Okay, we're going to go, like I said, on the opposite side of the plantation to the field hands. And the field hands, a lot of times I'm asked by especially minority groups, why should we participate in the national park? What does the national park do for us? And I want to give you an example of what it does. When the national park acquired this property, this is what the slave quarters tenant housing looked like. As you can see, it was pretty much on its way to the ground. So what they did for the first 15 years of the park was simply go through and take the buildings and try to stabilize them, so that today, this same building looks like this. And so when people say, what does the national park then do for minorities? One of the things that it does is it helps us to preserve our material culture. Material culture then being anything that we can touch and see and hold. So now we have not only the building to help with African American culture, but it also gives us a place to go inside of and offer another story about how people live.
Well,
Go ahead.
In this picture, is there a replica of what was actually around when the slaves occupied the building?
This is the original building.
No, I mean inside. Are there tables? Is there
Well, we're
beds?
going to go inside. Just give me just a moment. We're going to go inside. Okay, we're standing right now at the back of one of the cabins, and really what I want to point out here is this is Bermuda Bridge. This is part of the lake that runs all the way down, and this is important that the place was so close to the river, because what it did was that the workers then could go there to get their water, to wash their clothes. They could go there, they could fish, and transportation was by boat for the most part. If you didn't have a horse, you moved around by boat. And so all of this was very close then. So now what we're going to do is go right here to my right and enter into the back door. Excuse me, y'all. This is the back of the slave cabin. And we're starting here because this portion was actually added later, and that slave cabin is an incorrect term. It would have been part of the tenant era. This whole section was added later on, and really what it would have been is like a move up in status, because you were able to not just have the regular slave cabin portion, but another extended part of the building. And if you'll notice, the park intentionally left the building like this so that you can see how layers were put onto the house to kind of act like an insulation on the house. So we're going to go inside and step to the left as we enter. This area was the kitchen area. And we really don't have any replica stuff in there yet because most of the equipment has gone into just stabilizing the building. However, we got really lucky. There's a gentleman by the name of Mr. Alvin Shields, and Mr. Shields grew up here on this plantation. His parents were sharecroppers. He did the same thing. When he graduated from high school, he joined the military. After he left the military, he went to college, got a degree in engineering, and stayed away. Well, 2 years ago, he returned after being gone for over 43 years. And when he returned, he came back to the plantation because for him, this was home. And he wanted to retire in this area. And since he came, really within the last 2 months or so, he's been working with the park to help to recreate what the inside of this cabin would have looked like. And so this is some of the things that he has purchased for the park, that we might be able to start making the kitchen look like it looked when he was a little boy. So this gives you a sense of some of the things that are going to come inside. And so you had this little small table. I think it was him. He had like 4 other siblings, mother and father, all living here in this space. Now we're going to go and look directly behind us. If I did a turn like this, we're going to the other room. This section here was the bedroom. And if you'll notice, there are a couple of things that I'd like for you to notice. See the discoloration here in the walls, those pieces? All that means is that at some point there was some holes in the wall. And so they would take whatever they could find on the plantation, old discarded pieces of boarding, and fill it in order to close in those gaps. And now wallpaper, we all know wallpaper is for decoration purposes. But notice, it's about 2 or 3 layers here. Why do you think that might be?
I think that was the installation also.
Exactly, that's exactly what it was for. So instead of pulling down the old wallpaper and putting up new wallpaper, you just put it on top of each other. And so that was the installation. This bedroom was added by the Williams family. It was originally built for the grandmother. When the grandmother passed, then the mother moved to that room. Now that was really something for a parent to have their own bedroom because everybody slept in the same room. We're going to come out of this room now and enter into what was the original slave cabin. And excuse the quality of the picture, but we're going to look to the left as we get inside here. As you'll notice, again, there's no furnishings. This is something that the park has put here so that you can get an idea of what life was like inside. But the real thing that I want to point out here, if you notice right here in the window, you see the slats? This was for ventilation, but imagine what that must have been like in the summertime with the mosquitoes and the flies and all coming in. And it's on this portion, on this side of the cabin is where you would have had your beds. You would have laid them out, mostly more like a mattress, and then rolled them back up during the daytime. Now we're going to look directly behind us again to the other side of the cabin. Oh, before we begin doing that, I just wanted to remind you, though, some of the things that could have taken place inside of the cabin. Just like living in your home today. Quilting, sewing, you know. Later times, of course, doing tenant farming, we would have reading and writing. So these are some of everything that you would think about taking place in your own home took place in these houses as well. Now we're going to turn around and look behind us. This is the fireplace area. This is where the cooking would have taken place. This would have heated the entire facility when it was cold in the winter. If you notice this cabinet here to the left, the National Park is placing toys in here. Again, Mr. Shields, because of his having grown up there, remembered making toys as a child. And so he's made us a replica of the type of toys he played with. All they would do would take pieces of wire and string. And so here's a man with a plow behind a mule. You see that? Okay. And one thing that's important about that is that it shows what was important in that day. Because once you no longer use mules and they were replaced by tractors, what did you find little boys playing with?
Cars,
Tractors and all of that. And then today, what do you find little boys playing with?
military stuff. Mostly.
Military, okay. And so the toys are reflective of the social conditions and attitudes at that time. I just wanted to point that out to you a little bit. Now, over here in the corner by the fireplace is where the storytelling would have taken place. At winter, night, everybody's sitting inside, there's nothing to do. Somebody might tell a story. And so Mr. Alvin Shields shared how important that was to be able to do that. According to Mr. Shields.
Is that Mr. Shields?
At that time, families would talk. There was no TV. After dinner, everybody had to tell a story. Had to learn the story that you read, or that someone had read to you. And everything that happened the day at school, everybody had to basically testify what went on, what the teacher say, what did you learn. So the parents were learning along with the children.
And see how much we can gain from someone who actually lived on the plantation. How would we have known that the parents were learning from the students? But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense because they had never been exposed to education prior to that time. We've just stepped outside of the slave cabin. We're looking back into the front room. And again, you'll notice the several layers of wallpaper, but there's also something else that you notice on the wall. And what this was like is actually like a picture. We're going to zoom in on it. So it would have been used like you hang pictures in your house today. When you zoom in on it, what you see is that this came from a child's school project. It looked like they were working maybe with different food groups. And because the images were so colorful, then they would have used it like a picture because they couldn't have paid to have framing done and all of that. So you would often see in the cabins sheets from magazines and things just to decorate the walls to make it look more appealing, to make it more like a home. Okay, we've stepped off of the front porch, looking at the building again, and I wanted to be able to talk about the front porch because it was important for several reasons. One, in the summertime, this is mostly where people slept. It was cooler to be outside on the front porch than to be inside with 8, 9, 10 people. But it was also here on the porch that most of the children played, or very near the front porch, so the parents could keep an eye on them. According to Miss Davis, who used to live there, it was at the porch that they played Little Sally Walker and different games like little girls play, little ring games as we called them. For little boys, the porch area is more about marbles and playing with their own toys and things like that. But another thing about the porch is that this was also where the little boys made their own baseballs. And what they would do would take strips of string and old cloth and wind it around each other tight and taut. Anybody ever made one of those rubber balls where you take the rubber bands and keep building until it was the same concept? But they had a game that they did with it before they actually made it a baseball. Once it got the size they wanted it, the game was called Fireball. And they would take it and soak it in kerosene. Take it out of the kerosene, let the excess drip off, light it on fire. And the game was to toss it from one another without getting burned. You can believe that. But that was a game they played. So once all of that burned down and the inner part became very hard, then you just wrapped a little bit more to it, and that was a baseball. So they were very inventive in terms of entertainment.
Quite creative.
And this is the baseball team, the plantation baseball team. Baseball was very popular at that time. Each plantation had its own baseball team. And so there were friendly little competitions, sometimes not so friendly because money was on it. And so it was a way to bet as well. But this is akin, when you think about a business, to how many of you have seen Little Leaguers and on the back of their shirts say the team sponsored by Kroger or sponsored by Kmart? That was going on way before today. And the same thing, it helped to promote the business and keep up the workers' energy level.
Now I imagine this was way before the Negro League baseball.
Yes, it was before the Negro League.
So did they have a term that they called them, or?
No, they was the Bermuda baseball team or the Clutcheville baseball team or whatever the plantation name was, that was the name of the baseball team. Okay, I want to give you a sense of where you are now. We're going to step away from the porch and look out. This little bench right here, we like to think of as a place that once you come out of the slave cabins, the tenant cabins, that you can sit there and be reflective if you needed to be. And so it's a very peaceful place right under this great oak tree. And now again, just to give you this reference, we're here at the bench. But now if you look way here in this corner, you see another tenant house. This is one of the only two that are on the plantation left. And so this house, the one we just came out of, would have been about right in here. You would have had a row going all the way down of houses, and then from this end row coming all the way up. And so we think that in its heyday, there were 12 houses. Each house would have hosted 2 families. So it didn't matter what size the family was. If it was 3 to 14, that's how many was in the cabin. Now we're moving from the slave tenant quarters to the overseer's house. And the overseer, the main one there, was a man by the name of Seneca Pace. And why Seneca Pace is so important is because he kept plantation journals in which he documented many of the daily events that took place. And so he might talk about the weather, he might talk about the activities that happened, but it wasn't always a negative thing. Sometimes he documented stuff that we would never know about if he hadn't written it down. For example, here he's talking about Christmas time, that the hands went over, they had a dance, some were sick. The next day, they went back, they partied some more, and some of them got drunk, but nobody had an ill word towards each other. That's information that we could never know had it not been written down by Seneca Pace. So we get to see that it wasn't always about work. At least at Christmas time, they got to have a little bit of fun. The overseer's house, as we step inside, this is the back porch area, but also would have been like a bedroom as well. It was much larger than the slave cabins and the tenants' cabins. And this only represented one room, where this is almost the same size as the entire slave tenant cabin. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here because this was not a part of the world of the working so much as it was of management. So we're going to move on into the front room area. This is what the main room looked like. And so it's a very large space. You could have fit the slave tenant cabin inside of this space. And it's just one or two things I want to point out about this room. This is the Matuire family. They were the overseers of the plantation after slavery. You still had overseers. And so this family, this is the matriarch, Miss Lizzie Matuire, were the ones, when her husband died, they moved into Natchez, and they stayed in Natchez for less than a year. She decided that that was too big of a city life for her, and she wanted to come back to the plantation, so she did, and they stayed another 2 years until everybody else started moving away, of course, and then she moved as well. but I just wanted to show you some of the people that lived here. Now notice how grand this is compared to the slave cabin. You got French doors. What's different about the walls here versus the ones in the cabin? Did you notice anything different?
Well, for one thing, in the cabins, they had a lot of different little slits where things were falling off, and you had to do something to
Okay.
the slates, and you don't
Exactly.
have that there.
And
So it
open
was better
spaces.
feel, I would gather.
Exactly. This is all the things. You notice you don't have those little slats coming across. Instead, what you have is what is known as boussillage. Has anybody ever heard that term? Boussillage is a French word, and what it is they took clay, that old hard red Louisiana, and mixed it with different kinds of animal hair, deer hair, squirrel hair. And you mixed it with the water and everything, and when it dries, it hardens, and it's a very hard substance. Anyway, you would take that, and you would actually mold it onto the gaps in the walls and all, and it hardens and becomes a wall. And so if you look closely, since this was all done by hand, you see some areas like here, you can see the worker's fingerprints as they molded and shaped this. And you'll notice the difference as we climb up the ladder of the business. The managers had some protection from the elements outside. The slave quarters had very little, and it even gets better when we get to the CEO's office, right? Okay. So, just to give you some sense here, these are all the kinds of things, because I think that most people, when they think about the field workers, they think about them being out in the fields, picking cotton and corn all day long. But as you can see, they did a multitude of things. They have to build roads. You know, they have to plow gardens. They hauled in wood, because a lot of the wood is what they were going to use to build with. And they also did things like build shower houses. Anybody ever heard of a shower house? And what do you think it might be used for?
Shower, bathroom, bath.
Outside.
Okay. And it seems so obvious, but that wasn't it at all. What the shower house was when, think about it, you're out there working in the fields, you're a good little distance from your house. If a sudden storm came up, well, instead of making everybody go all the way back to their house, you went to the shower house until the rain stopped so that you could get right back to work. So they built
It was
all
literally
these
for the
things.
showers
It was really
that
for the
came up.
showers.
How big was the shower house?
We don't have any exact dimensions, but we know they existed because it comes up numerous times about the repair work done. So, you know, you could take on an average day, you had 40 to 50 workers in the field or more. So you had several shower houses. It wasn't just one, they were scattered throughout. And I thought it would be interesting to look at this. This was what kind of work happened in the year of 1860. In 2001, a former worker at the plantation was interviewed, and this is the kind of chores she said that she also participated in. So as you can see, she did a little bit of everything. She said, I pulled corn, potatoes, plant gardens, cut winter wood. I did it all. Just like a day in the life of a slave over 150 years later. Okay. We're going to leave there and go to the corn crib. This building here was built in 1820s to 1830s, not sure of an exact date. This structure right here is how they would have collected water. Notice how the roof is made. You have a little gutter system running along here. And so when it rained, the water would fall and collect down in here. And this is the water that they would use then during drought times and to also do the livestock, to be able to have water for livestock. When it came time to harvest corn, this was a process that lasted over a few days, and everybody was involved because you had a short period of time to get it done. And so sometimes they would be up very, very, very late at night. And so to make it more interesting or more fun while they were inside, they would sing songs sometimes, you know, and keep a cadence just like if you would in the field. This is the inside of the gin barn. Notice how high it is. When everything is done, it would have been full, so that you would have enough to be able to feed the livestock, which at that time was also the enslaved labor force. And look, notice the nice craftsmanship in there as well. These are all, pretty much all single boards that were placed like that. All right, now, so you're not confused about where you are. We just left here at the barn. We're going to go from here to the plantation store, and then from here back over to the carpenter shop in the mule barn. As we make our trek from here to here, this is what you would see here on your right. What this is just a set of outbuildings, but this was the doctor's house, the plantation doctor's house. Why would a plantation need a doctor on the place?
Because you had all the workers, and you got to keep them well to keep the plantation running smoothly.
Exactly. You need to be able, and you think about a business today. Don't you have nurses on staff and somebody there, some medical emergency? But he basically took care of the major things. Let's say if there was a typhoid epidemic or something like that. Most of the minor stuff, even birthing, was left to the midwives and the people right there in their cabins. So really, he had a cushy job, if you look at it. Okay, now as we're passing again from this space here to here, and we look over to this side, what we're going to see is what's called a pigeonnier. A pigeonnier was used to store pigeons. That's all it was for. And pigeons were considered a delicacy. So everything that came out of here went to the CEO's office of the plantation owner. Okay. Now we're coming up on the back of the plantation store. And the plantation store, many people will say, was another form of slavery. Why do they think it was another form of slavery?
I would say because everything that they needed to purchase, they had to buy it there from the owners. And so they were steady working and not ever gaining anything because they were paying it right back.
That's exactly what it was. You know, you think about a plantation system, the nearest or closest town was almost 30 miles away. That was Natchez. So it needed to be totally self-sufficient. And that's what it was. It was self-sufficient. But it also was a way in which it kept people in debt, just as it was explained by the lady here in the audience. They used the tokens, store tokens, to keep people in debt. So instead of coming in at the end of the year and you say, I made $40, instead of me getting $40, I got 40 tokens that could only be spent at the plantation store. So I never had an opportunity then to save my money and move away if I wanted to, because it had to be spent at the plantation store.
And every plantation had their own coin?
Every plantation had their own coin, so you couldn't even go over to another plantation and help somebody out over there. So, but now, even though I'm talking about the negative parts of the plantation store, this was also like the center, the hub of social activity on the plantation, because it was here that everything took place. You know, you played checkers on the porch. Sometimes they would bring in live bands so that they could entertain as well here on the porch. And on Sunday mornings, the men would gather before church, maybe talk about religion, maybe a little bit about local events. This is Monique Toussaint. He was a slave at Oakland and was the fiddle player. Many of his descendants are right here still in the area today. But even looking at the name, what does it tell you about him?
He's French.
He's French. He's French. He was in French Louisiana, so whatever they grew up around is what they became. And so his music then would have been a combination of like a French Creole and perhaps a little African mix. And so to talk about that, I brought these. Anybody know what these are?
No.
No idea. These are rib bones, just from a cow or something like that you can use. And so these are like a percussion instrument, which means it's just a striking instrument. And because they didn't really have instruments, he had a fiddle. Everything else would have been handmade. What they would do is after the cow was processed and all, they take these bones and let them dry and get hard. Then you take it, you put one between your finger, hold it in place, this stays steady. You take the other one, put it here between, this is the one that moves. And you only get two sounds. You get a strike, 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 or a clackety, clackety, clack. And so I'll show you how that works. Hold this one here, this stays steady. Put this one here between your finger, it moves. And so as he's playing, let's try this. Well, you know, it'd be nice if I use my right hand. We'll see if we can go get a little sound here. Right there. All I can do is a clap. I'm not getting it right here. Okay, and that would have been it. I'm going to pass these around. You can take a look at them if you like.
Did they should like those shoes? Or this?
No, this was actually belonged to a man out of Natchez that used to play the bones, and he wanted a black anthropologist or somebody to have it, and so they were given to me.
Oh, okay.
And just simple bones, and so you didn't have to pay for your instruments. You know, you can just collect
There's
something.
no money.
Everything was used. Everything was used. Okay, we're stepping into the plantation store, and as you can see here, there were shelves on the right and the left, and these shelves would have been full of supplies that were needed. We're going to take a look over here to the left a little bit closer, and what we can see then is that you could have gotten oil cans and grease cans, and you could have gotten dyes and tints for your hair and things like that. But what does this look like right here, this little squared off section? These were the postal boxes, because the store was also the post office during that day. So not only did it serve the needs of the people who lived on the plantation, but all of the neighbors close around as well. They came here not only to purchase their goods, but also to pick up their mail.
But the slaves didn't.
Not the slaves, because the plantation
Non-slaves.
store would not have been here until after slavery.
Oh,
That's
okay.
when the plantation store started. And so you're getting your dyes and stuff, you're getting your tobacco products and your snuff and your skull and all that kind of stuff. And then during the Great Depression, something changed. And the tokens were no longer any good. And instead, they were replaced by food coupons. And so they were even able to take the food coupons at the store. And all of this feel of the store and being a sharecropper and being in that sense of indebtedness is kind of talked about here briefly by Mr. James Hilaire, who also grew up on Oakland. And he just talks about, you know, his mother and father were sharecroppers. That's what he called his father. Sometimes they would go into debt and sometimes not. But you always settled up at the end of the year, right after Christmas. Maybe that's why they were drinking so high, because they knew it was almost time to settle up. Okay, this is the plantation store from the beginning, when the National Park first acquired it. This is how it looks today. Because when gasoline comes along and you needed to run your cars, you got to come to the plantation store for gas too. So they really had a monopoly on business back then. Now we're moving over here to the mule barn. The mule barn is about 40 yards from the back door of the store, which is where we were at first. This is a magnificent structure right here, very old. This is what would have housed the next most important labor force on the plantation, because next to the hands, then your hoofed animals were the next important, and so you wanted them taken care of. And not only the mules, but you also had horses. And who do you think worked with those horses?
The workers, the
Of
slaves.
course. Lawrence Hilaire talks about going out as little boys. They would get them wild out of the woods, bring them back, and then train those horses in order to work. And not only did they use them for working, but they also did stunt riding with them. Look at this picture right here in the right-hand corner. Notice the two boys, they're actually standing on top of the horses as they're moving. So they were very experienced with horses.
That's why you had those black rodeo worker cowboys way back when.
Exactly, because especially in Texas and Louisiana, where you had a large cattle population, they were being managed with horses. Then you had people growing up around horses all their lives. If we go inside of the stables, you see, of course, all of the different stalls. But what's important here is this brick foundation. That speaks to the wealth of the plantation. Most of the stalls would have been built on the ground. And many of these bricks were built by the workers right there on the plantation. But another thing that's really important, notice the length of this board. If we go from here all the way to the end, that's one solid tree trunk. So they would have had to haul this in one piece and then form it to make it fit what they wanted to. This is called hand-honed wood. That means everything was done by hand. Look at the hash marks that you can still see, and where they made their own holes in order to lock the gates and things with. So everything was done by hand. So if nothing else, it speaks to what went into creating a building this large and this stable. Now the people who did this are the specialized laborers, because they had a skill that no one else had. During slavery, sometimes a person was picked and they were sent away to be trained so they could come back with that skill to the plantation. This is the carpenter shop. It was probably the very first building on the plantation, because he would have needed a space to work out of in order to make the other buildings that they were going to need. The person that we know as the carpenter was a gentleman by the name of Solomon Wilson. This is just giving you another angle here of the shed. Most of the buildings have no furnishing. We're not going to really per se go inside, but I just want to give you a sense of what it took to make these buildings. At that time, there was no such thing as making nails out of metal. So they did what's known as a dovetail construction. That means all of the pieces are interlocked, and that's what holds it together. You will not find one nail in this building, nor the corn crib, nor the mule barn. And that says a whole lot. Who's a master craftsman? And we very rarely hear about workers as master craftsmen. We just say they're workers.
So kind of like the floor today, those laminate floors, stick them together and they
And pop them into place, exactly. And so an entire building could be moved exactly that way. They would go back down the sides and mark them, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tick up the whole building and move it somewhere else and rebuild it exactly the way it was, with each piece fitting exactly where it was supposed to fit.
Not only were they skillful, but they were very intelligent.
Very intelligent, exactly. And that's something we don't often hear about when we hear about workers on the
So
plantation.
the people who were the master craftsmen, did they get their own children to become master craftsmen by
Usually,
watching them?
yes, if you had a skill, you passed it on to your child. That's how it kind of stayed in the family. Well, think about it just like a business. If you work in the office as a secretary and you don't want your daughter maybe working out in the warehouse, then you're going to train her to be a secretary. It's the same concept.
That comes from the Bible when they had the tribes, the ones that were over the treasury, all their kids was trained for that. The ones that were over the building, all the kids was, and it just went down from generation to generation.
Exactly.
So that's the same.
The same principle. You end up with several generations doing the same exact task. By then, they're masters at it, if you will. Another person that had a specialized skill was Solomon Williams, who was the blacksmith. And Solomon is described as a large man with a size 12 shoe and a long white beard. Of course, we don't have any images of him, but he was the only person after emancipation able to negotiate a wage. And by that, what I mean is that instead of every year settling up to see did he do okay, maybe his wage might have been $8 a month. Whatever needs to be done, you know. His son, he had a wife, Lucida, and they had many children, one of whom was William. William, after the Civil War and the Union troops went through, he left with them, joined the Buffalo Soldiers, stayed with them a while, and then went on and lived in California. So many of his descendants are also still in the area. And this is one of my favorite pieces by him, is this right here. This is a cross that he made for his wife's grave when she passed. Notice the craftsmanship.
You see the love in it.
The love. And so just to give you a sense of what the blacksmith shop may have looked like on the inside and what we hope to recreate at some point, I put this here. And also, just to give you a little sound, can you imagine the anvil as it's hitting down? I can just hear the clang, hitting that anvil down on the metal.
Bloody old gray man that I bloody couldn't. When I make my 50 cent, Lord, I carry it home to Roseanne.
So you make a little money and take it home to his wife. Now, right next door here to the carpenter's shed is what we call the chicken coop, the fattening pen, and the wash house. And this is just exactly in that order. The chicken coop is exactly what it implies, just where you kept the chicken so you could get the eggs. This is located directly behind the main house. And so everything here was pretty much for the consumption of the owners. The fattening pen, of course, was used when you wanted to get an animal prepared when you're going to put him on the table. And so you would place the animal in the fattening pen, feed them corn for however many days, 30 days or whatever, and then you would go ahead and slaughter that animal. Right at winter time, in order to prepare for winter, they would have what's known as hog killing time. As many as 40 or 50 hogs would be slaughtered, because think, you're not only feeding the main house, you're trying to feed the entire plantation. So they would do this, and every portion of the hog was used. Again, everything is recycled. There's nothing to be thrown away. And so one of the ways that the hog's hoof was used is described here. They would take that and put it in the fireplace and parch it in the hot ashes. And then after they would parch it in there, they would take it and make a tea out of it. You know, steam it like you know. And that was what was a cure for pneumonia back then. So they would boil the hog's hooves and you drink that as a tea to help get rid of pneumonia. Now, did it work? Who knows? It may have, it may not, but how many of you would be willing to try that today? I don't see any hands going up. I don't see any hands going up.
At least it probably worked on a few people.
Yeah.
And that was enough.
That was enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or just made you feel better to have tea. Mm-hmm. Now, the washerwoman, this was one of the hardest jobs on the plantation because you're fooling with hot stuff all day long. You're building fires, you got pots that's boiling, you have to take the clothes and wash them, you take them out, you rinse them, you boil them again, and then you got to take them and hang them up. Hard work for $8 a month, but that was considered a decent pay back then. Elizabeth was hired as the cook and the washer. She did everything for $8 a month. And I just wanted to give you guys a sense. Now, all of these names are from slavery times. Of all the specialized laborers, though, that was on the plantation, you had a coach driver. It was just his job to drive the family around wherever they wanted to go. You know, in addition, people that you already know about would have been, of course, your house servants. You had your carpenters, your blacksmiths, your cooks, your midwives, your weavers. So it took, and these are just the names we know. There are probably others, but just for you to get a sense. And then also their value. This is how much they were worth if he had to get rid of one or if one was lost. And it's also through the specialized laborers that the company was able to make more money because they would loan them out to other people sometimes. If you had a skill as a carpenter, okay, I'll loan him out to you until he builds that building for you and you send the money back with him. And that's how they did it.
Did the person with the specialized skill get any of that money when they were loaned out?
No, they didn't get that money. And the only time it really worked would have been an earlier period, and we'll talk about that maybe after the presentation, how that would have worked. So again, I just want to remind you where we are. We just left here at the fattening pen in the washerwoman's house. We're going to go to the cook's house and then to the main house, and that's going to conclude our tour. Okay? Now the cook would not have been a field laborer. She would not have been a specialized laborer. What she would have been considered is a house servant. Even though the cook's house is where it is today, this is not where it originally would have been. It would have been much closer to the main house, but it caught on fire. When they rebuilt it, they moved it here during the Depression and rented it out as a fishing camp so that they could make more money. So then they built all this extra stuff on around it, but this was portion of the original cook's house. Again, we're not going to go inside, but just imagine having to cook a meal like that at least twice a day, using this pots and all, no modern day equipment, no stoves, no microwaves, and doing this twice a day, every day.
And they didn't consider that as a skilled labor?
No, it was more of a house. And actually, that actually elevated her social status a little bit more than a specialized laborer because she worked with the house.
Did she also have to do the dishes, take them out?
Yes, they would have had people
But they had-
helping her with that. Some of the younger girls would have helped with that were in the house. Now we're going to leave the cook's cabin and head towards the big house. As we get closer in, you notice everything starts to look very different than when it did in the slave tenant quarters and when it did at the overseer's house. I thought we'd use a little Christmas stuff since we're so close to the holidays. But we're standing here at the front gate looking at the front house. And there are a couple of things I want to point out. One, this is a combination. When you say Creole, that means combining two different cultural groups together. And so the French part of this house is the wraparound porch and all, and the high-hipped roofs. This portion, with it being up so high off the ground, comes from West Indies. Because what it did is allow air to come up underneath and keep the house cool. Even parts of the porch could really be said as part of West Indies as well, because you're getting a breeze up through there. And so what we're going to do now is look straight over as though we're going into this fenced-in area, and there's what was known as the bottle garden. We're standing right up on the top of the porch looking down. And it's called the bottle garden for obvious reasons. It's a garden that's outlined in bottles. There are hundreds and hundreds of these bottles, old wine bottles and beer bottles and all of that. But what's important about this is not just the aesthetic beauty, but that you almost have to have a horticulturalist in order to be able to work with this. They had to keep it weeded. Occasionally they would pull out the bottles and reset them so that the earth wouldn't grow up over the top of it. And at every time of the year, there is something in bloom in this garden, at any time of the year. And so they had to know where to plant certain things in order to make them blossom as well. And so when we think about people working on the plantation, we got to also think about the aesthetic beauty. So that when you're standing on the porch stand and looking back down, this is what you see. There's the river right across there. You've got these rows and rows of huge oaks, this beautiful garden, and you're coming up a brick step and up brick staircasing. Think about today, when you walk up to a business, if you see that it is well manicured, it's attractive, it's well painted, what does it tell you about that business?
They're doing well.
They're doing well. And that's exactly the message they wanted to send as well, that we're doing well here. And you can see it anytime you pass by. From the slave cabins all the way to the main house. You see building after building after building, just like a company complex. Okay, let's go inside. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the inside because this was the world of a very select few people. But what I want to say about the people that worked in the house, of course, was the obvious things. They were responsible for every aspect from the ceiling to the floor. You had to keep the windows clean, to wash and polish the floors, and keep the tablecloths ironed and pressed and things like that. And so there are some things that we are very aware of that was involved. This is what the main house looked like, though, at a much later period. We talk about the 1960s. It wouldn't have been quite this modern. But during slavery, at least, one of the roles of young boys would be to pull this string. You can see the string coming here off of what's known as a punka. And what the punka did is when you pull the string, it waves like a fan. And so it goes across the whole table to keep the flies away, to keep the guests cool. Now imagine a dinner that's 2 or 3 hours long. And you're steady waving this fan back and forth. It looked like you had a question.
I did. First of all, what's it called again?
A punka, P-U-N-K-A, a punka.
Did they have the children to rotate? Because if you're kids, you get tired.
You know, they had so many houseboys, and I can't say if he had to the entire time, but I imagine that was your job. Okay, and so this would have been more likely a job for some of the younger boys, you know, and for the younger girls, then they would have been caretakers. And so here goes this, I'm teaching my child now how to do the job that I do. And so these are some obvious things that we know then about what it might have been like to work in the house. But then there are also some other things that I like to call the myth of the house nigger. What are some things as African Americans that we've heard about people who worked in the house versus those who worked in the field?
That they thought that,
They was light skinned. What
that
else?
they thought they were better.
They thought they were better. What else have we heard? They were mistresses. Okay, and that's true. All of these things have some legitimacy to it as well. And that's why I call it the myth, though, because these are the things that we've always heard, but there are other things that we need to understand. For example, this woman likely raised 3 generations of the same family. For a moment, just put yourself in her place. I've raised this child from a suckling to an adult. He gets married, he has children. Now I raise his children. Then he gets grown, and he gets married, and he has children. But at no time am I considered a part of this family. And so the feeling that they must have had at that time. And then another misconception is that because they worked in the house then, they were more for the house folks than they were for the field folks. But it was oftentimes the house servants who carried the information to the field folks about what was going on. If they overheard conversations about the Civil War, if they overheard a conversation about who was going to be sold next, it was the house person that got it back out to the fields. So that's one of the misconceptions. Another thing too is that unlike a field worker who at the end of the day, even though they work from sun up to sundown, at the end of the day, they had their own space that they could go to. It was their space to do what they needed to do. The house servant was on call 24 hours a day. We're standing here at the back of the main house. You see this gentleman right here at this space? I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit. What he is looking into is a bedroom that was located up under the house. This room belonged to a woman named Mary. She was 59 years old. She was the house servant. There was a trap door that goes from her ceiling then up into the master's bedroom, so that if they wanted to during the night just have a cup of tea, they could, and she had to get up and come. So there's also a misconception about being in that position. And then of course it's the stuff we already know about. They were basically concubines. Concubines, really, the definition is you're living in a house with a man unmarried and you're like second to his wife, your mistress. And it was from these unions, you know, that we start to see, especially in Louisiana, these French Creole mixtures, because there was so much of that going on. And the Prudhomme family was no different. This is a woman who is a black Prudhomme, and there are many still in Natchez today. I just want to bring us to a conclusion at this point in our journey. And one of the things that I want to say, I showed this tree because to me this tree signifies strength and continuity. It's gone through many different storms, and it's still standing. It's gone through different time periods in American history, and it's still standing. It's gone through changes in the landscape around it, and it's still standing. So to me, it's also about fortitude. And as a worker on a plantation, you had to have all of those things, because despite the conditions, this was the condition of your life. But instead of being drugged down by it, you used it as a way to build family, to build community, and a sense of home. Okay? And so that's what I'd like to leave you with, and I'd like to take this opportunity now, if you will, to pass out a survey form and ask you to fill it out and show me how I might be able to do this a little bit better at another time. And if there are any comments that you'd like to make at this time, that would be good. Are there any questions, anything I didn't cover that you'd like for me to cover?
I have one question. And I had heard, I don't know how true it is, that